All right, so now that we've taken a quick look at the damage and explosion system, let's go ahead and get started.
All right, we'll turn our attention over to configuration to get things kicked off. Inside of our config class, we'll drop in the property for the damage effect timeout, and this is going to be how long each flicker actually lasts. So I'm going to drop this in right above the asteroid configuration. To do this, we'll drop in a public static double field, and we'll call this field damage effect timeout. And damage effect timeout is going to be set to a value of 0.2 seconds. Now that we have this value, we can jump over to game node and set up game node to handle switching back and forth between normal texture for the sprite and damage texture for the sprite, and we'll use a timer inside of game node to handle how long we should stay in the damage mode of the texture. To do this, we're going to need to add a new field to game node. We'll add a timer field. We'll call this timer hit timer. Now inside of the constructor, we need to add a few lines of code to set up the timer. So we'll drop down our braces so we can add in a block of code. We'll begin by instantiating the timer. So hit timer will be equal to a new instance of timer. Then we'll turn around and we'll subscribe to this new timer's fire event. So hit timer.fire we will subscribe to, and upon loading up the subscription operator, we see that we're presented with a possible code template. I'll hit tab to drop that in. We're also given a possible name for the actual handler. I'll hit tab again to acknowledge this and drop the handler in place. So this has created a handler called hit timer _fire. And inside of this handler is what happens after, you can say, the damage flicker time has run out. As soon as the timer fires, that's the only time we were looking for. So once this timer hits, we'll set our texture back to normal, and we'll also stop the timer so we don't continuously set to 0 unnecessarily. So we need to look into our sprite. This is our game node sprite, and we'll set its texture index back to 0, where 0 is the normal texture. And then we'll set our hit timer, and we'll tell it to stop. And that takes care of the hit timer event handler. Now we need to turn our attention over to take damage, and in the case that we take damage but are not killed, we need to show the flicker effect. So we have an if statement that checks to see if we had died. What we'll do is we'll add an else clause to that, because if we met the conditions for death, then death occurs. Otherwise, we're actually still in existence. And in this otherwise scenario, we'll set up to initiate our damage flicker. So we'll say this.sprite.textureIndex equals 1. So we switch over to the damage version of the texture. And then we'll tell our hit timer to start. So this.hitTimer.start. Start requires the interval to be fed in, and that interval comes from config.damage effect timeout. And with that, we should actually be ready to build and test. We'll build, we have no errors, so let's start the game, and now watch the asteroid as it slams into the ship. The ship flickers for a second after hitting the asteroid, and the last two just disappear, so we have no time to see a damage flicker. If I were to go into config and change our asteroid's health back up to 51, we should see the asteroid, the second asteroid, survive, and now it should be the asteroid receiving the damage flicker.
Nice. Very nice.
So relatively simple to put in place with timers. And now that allows us to turn our attention over to explosions. Now an explosion is a separate effect outside of the node in question, because after a node is destroyed, it immediately disappears.
Right.
An effect should linger for an amount of time long enough for the effect to play out and then itself go away. That means the effect is going to need to be a separate node. So what we're going to do is go down to game, and we'll make a new class, and this will be our effect node class. Effect node is going to directly extend node. But before I jot that in, let's clean up our sub namespace, and let's also add in a using for XNA.framework. So Microsoft.xna.framework will give us the types that we need access to. Then effect node is going to directly extend node. Once again, this is extending node instead of game node, because all we need here is an object that can exist at some position on the screen. We don't need things like health, or the ability for the explosion itself to take damage, or the ability for the explosion to collide. We don't need any of that, so we'll simply derive from node and leave off all of the extra stuff. Now we'll set up a constructor first to handle the incoming sprite sheet, and also to set up our listening out for our sprite's loop event. So this will be a public constructor for effect node.
We'll also use this to go ahead and set our position as well.
Right, well, and yeah, we'll get to that in just a second here. We will include it also in the constructor's signature, though. So we're looking to take in a sprite sheet, once again, just to satisfy the call to the base constructor. But to streamline the creation of an effect node, we're actually going to take in a vector2 for position. That way we'll simply require that the effect node be positioned upon creation, because throughout Spacefighter, effect nodes are always going to be spawned at the node that just exploded. So if we didn't take in a position immediately, we would always need to turn around and set one immediately. So this simply streamlines the creation of the effect node. So we'll take in position as a vector2, and then we can make our call to the base constructor and pass along the sprite batch, or excuse me, sprite sheet. And we'll drop in the brackets for the body of the constructor. Two things we need to do here. First, we need to subscribe to this effect node's sprite loop event, because it's upon loop that we'll use as a marker to say that, okay, the entire sprite sheet has finished playing one cycle, and now it needs to go away. Because in the case of an explosion, you have something that is not meant to be played as a loop, it's meant to be played as a one-time effect. So we'll wait till we get to the end of that, and then simply remove it out. So we'll look at our sprites loop event. We'll subscribe to it. I'll hit tab to drop in a new notify handler, and tab again to accept the name sprite_loop. And this will drop in the handler itself. Before we jump into that handler, though, let's finish off the constructor. And the other thing the constructor needs to do is to take into account that position and set the effect node's position. So this dot position will be equal to the given position parameter. Now that that's in place, we can turn our attention over to sprite loop and code this in. Once again, upon a loop event occurring, we wish to have this effect node simply removed from the game, so we'll run a call to this dot remove, and that will take care of our effect node's behavior. And really, that takes care of the effect node itself. Really very simple to put together, thanks in part to the fact that we have access to a loop event that we can subscribe to. Let's build. We see that there are no errors, so now let's move back over to the game node class and put in a few more fields to finish this off. As a matter of fact, let's first visit the config class, because we need to establish a sprite sheet for explosions. So jumping over to config, which has fallen off the edge of the screen. Inside of config, let's jump in right below the damage effect timeout, and let's make a new public static sprite sheet. This sprite sheet will be called small explosion sprite sheet. And we'll set this to a new instance of sprite sheet. The asset name that we're looking for is over here as explosion_small. Now for the dimensions of the explosion, let me briefly bring up our original source images folder so that we can take a look at how many tiles we'll be needing to fit this. So here we have images and explosion small. We can see that we have 3 tiles across in X and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tiles down in Y. So then tiles X shall be 3, tiles Y shall be 5. I'm going to set the frame rate to a value of 30 so that the effect plays back rather quickly. And now we get to look at one of the other overloads for the sprite sheet constructor. Since this is an explosion ever going to need to show a damage flicker itself? Well, no, you can't destroy an explosion. An explosion is something getting destroyed.
That's right.
So we're going to use a sprite sheet mode of no damage texture. There is no reason to go through and pre-process the explosion texture and make a damageable version of it that we'll never use. So now that we have an explosion sprite sheet, now we can jump into game node and set up a few fields and some methods to handle exploding game nodes. The first field we'll add is a sprite sheet that goes along with game node that holds what explosion should be used in the event that this game node does in fact explode. The reason we're dropping this here inside of game node is, again, so that each individual game node can have a unique explosion if we wanted to. So that way, say, for example, sidearms could explode differently than ships, and projectiles could explode differently than enemies. So this field is going to be public. It's going to be a sprite sheet field, and we'll call it explosion sprite sheet. Now we can take a look at a method that we can use to actually cause a sprite effect node to be created. We'll jump in here just after our take damage method, and we'll create a new method. This is going to be a protected method. It will be virtual in nature, and we'll call this explode. The reason we're making it protected is just to make sure that outside of game node things don't get confusing, because if you were looking through the members of game node and you noted or saw that you could cause game nodes to explode, the first thing that would come to mind is, you can invoke this externally and the game node will go away. The key here is that explode only causes the effect to be spawned. It doesn't actually remove the game node. So we'll leave it protected such that it can only be used inside of game node or its descendants. Now, inside of explode, the idea is that explode will create a new effect node. Now, we're only going to create a new effect node if we do have an explosion sprite sheet, because that's not part of the constructor. It's not necessarily required to be set. So we want to make sure that we have a sprite sheet to use in explosions before we make an explosion. So we'll check and say if this .explosion sprite sheet is not equal to null, then we'll turn around and we'll spawn a new effect node. That effect node is going to require a sprite sheet, which we have just determined that we have stored in the field this.explosion sprite sheet. We're also going to need a position to create the effect node, and we'll set that equal to our current position, so this.position. And that takes care of the creation of the effect node. Now, let's go up to take damage and make a call to explode just before the node itself gets removed. So up here in take damage, in the case that we have run out of health and are about to be removed, let's first make a call to this.explode. And one last thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we do set up the explosion sprite sheet for things that can explode, and that includes the asteroid and the player ship. So if we jump over to the asteroid class, inside of its constructor we can jump down below health and also set up this.explosion sprite sheet and set that equal to config.small explosion sprite sheet. Then I'll copy this line and jump over to the player ship class and do the same thing. Right after we set health, we'll paste in the explosion sprite sheet and get that configured. And now that that's set up, let's build and run the game and see what happens as we slam into asteroids. First asteroid has an explosion effect. The second one causes the ship to explode.
Very nice.
And just to point out the use of the event handler here, if we go back to effect node and we remove our subscription to the sprite loop event handler, let's see what would have happened. We hit an asteroid, and then that effect node never goes away. Nothing removes it. So we are set here left with our effect nodes, and they play continuously. So that's where we're using the loop event to say that our animation for the effect has finished, and when it does finish, we remove out, and that entire effect node goes away. And we have the necessary damage flicker to go along with it. And that is what we wanted to get accomplished for damage effects, including the flicker using the damage texture and the spawning of an effect node to give a visual explosion.
Nice. So with that, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.